Hi. So the guys asked me to come along and talk about something I spent 2.5 years of my life doing. Sort of finished up last year actually, but before that, my background's electrical engineering and worked at Nokia, worked at the university, then worked in heavy industry around here, and then eventually started working at CSIRO, which I'll assume most people are familiar with as far as Australia's sort of national research agency. And a lot of our bread and butter at CSIRO is really about coming up with ideas that solve a problem and then spinning it out, frankly. You know, I've done 8 different businesses that we've spun out that somehow I've been involved in. But I guess the reason I was asked to come along and talk was because of one particular spin out where I wasn't just involved, but I was actually asked to go and run it and get it off the ground. And so that was a company called Evergen. And Evergen is a company that puts solar, we say managed, but solar and battery systems in people's homes and businesses. So I, at CSIRO, lead our energy centre over at Newcastle, and we do a lot of work around how do we help people in industry save energy. And one of those things that we came up with 5 years ago was some technology to manage. We thought batteries were going to be a thing in people's homes, and we came up with some technology to how do you help people get the most out of those batteries and be able to make actual income from those things, as well as saving you some money in your house. And so, so we had that technology, and then we were approached by AMP, as in the bank. AMP Bank have an investment arm called AMP Capital, who typically own big poles and wires, big pieces of infrastructure. So they own electricity companies, hospitals, bridges, airports, stuff like that. I guess the key point being electricity companies to me. So they own the traditional energy businesses, if you like. And they had seen a report that we did at CSIRO called That Thing, which was really about how is the electricity world changing. And this report, if you're an energy person, got a fair bit of attention because it said stuff like the electricity network in a few years is going to be less than half utilised. It said stuff like 30 to 40% of our generation will be things that are in people's homes and businesses. And so it got a lot of attention because it was talking about back in 2014, you know, this very dramatic change that is really, we're in the middle of now. And so AMP, who own all the traditional infrastructure, said, ooh, we can see disruption coming. How can we get involved in understanding the disruption and what it might mean to where we pour a lot of money into normally? And so they came to us and said, we want to work with CSIRO on establishing a disruptor, on establishing a company that's going to really take advantage of some of this new opportunity. And they called that Project Vault. So, like any project, it's got to have a code name. And it was called Project Vault, and we spent a lot of time really brainstorming ideas for a new business. So it was pretty fun in that we got to have a clean sheet of paper and work with my team, who are all mostly technical people and some economists, and then AMP, who are a bunch of financial analysts who are incredibly boring, but they look at things in a very hard, black and white manner. Is this, do they think this thing can make money or not? And so we came up with a huge range of ideas, from literally companies that would have robots that would drill holes in the ground and pour concrete for huge solar farms, through to residential energy services businesses, which is what we ended up settling on. So Project Vault sort of matured into this concept where we could see there was an opportunity to offer solar and battery systems to mums and dads, to manage those on their behalf, to maximise the return on these things, because they're actually pretty complicated pieces of equipment, to get the most life out of them, and to be able to figure out when do you charge or discharge the battery to both save someone the most money at home, but if you discharge a battery today, you can actually sell that electricity and make even more money from it. So you need some intelligence, some software intelligence, and how do you do all of that? So that was what we settled on as the business. I guess, then the crazy bit was, they came and said, well, we need to get a team And AMP approached CSIRO and said to my boss, we'd like Glenn to run it. And so I'd spun out a lot of businesses, but I certainly hadn't been a founding CEO. And so CSIRO gave me some time off. Originally it was 6 months to go and help get this thing going, and they were going to recruit someone else in that period to found it. So they gave me 6 months where I basically moved to Sydney for 6 months, and because that's where AMP was, and we started really incubating the business, if you like. We did all the usual stuff that if you're going through this sort of program or any of the other incubator accelerator sort of programs, you have competitor analysis and so on, and so we looked at where does this organisation that we wanted to start fit amongst the competitors. It's interesting to anyone who works in energy to sort of look at this slide from 3 years ago and compare it to today, because in that dotted red box, there's the company I started, but there's about 4 or 5 others who saw the same opportunity, and if you look at it today. So back then though, it was a bit of a blank area. We then spent a lot of time doing hideously complex things like this, which is what happens when you let analysts who spend their time advising on building IT systems and get involved. And so this was planning of, you know, how's the business going to operate, and what are the information and money flows that you need. Fundamentally, we were trying to ask the question, if this business gets off the ground and accelerates in the way that the investors want it to, then what sort of infrastructure are we going to need? What sort of minimal investment are we going to need within a few years? So this was not in the frame of mind of sort of a 2-person company that might go for 5 years and become 3 and go for another 5 and become 4. The investors behind this company certainly wanted to have grown very, very dramatically. And so when you were looking at growing very dramatically, we were saying, well, what's the minimum capital we need to build all of this stuff, to build all these supply chain management, because we were installing big pieces of equipment, battery and solar panels in people's homes, to do all the billing and settlements and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a terrible amount of time spent on that. Then we had the fun of going and finding an office, and that was literally myself and 2 other guys who by then had joined the team, looking around in the Sydney CBD going, my God, you want us to pay what for an office space? And that became one of our offices. Evergen also established an office in Newcastle, which, you know, I'm very passionate Novocastrian and wanted to have an office up here. We then started building prototype software and consumer experience things. So these were real prototypes that operated as far as, you know, what the user interface would look like for our app on your phone that operated. You're not a startup unless you've got an app, and we had an app that was operating, that telling you what the battery system is doing and how it's operating, the solar's working in your house. We then started working with industrial designers on mocking up the hardware. So again, we were a bit unusual in that we wanted to go and build significant pieces of hardware. So that was our battery system. This was an in-home display that we were working on that you would put on your wall in your kitchen, and it'd help you change modes. So you'd say, well, I'm going out on holidays for a month, take my house into away mode, which would operate the battery differently, or I want to go off grid, and if that means I've got to turn the air conditioner off, so be it, etc. That's the same blank, empty office building about 9 months later. So we established a company. We went live in July 2016, and by then we'd already been operating with a staff of around 20. We'd been operating in stealth mode and really doing prototypes and testing in friends and family of the hardware and so on, but the business went live in the middle of 2016 selling product. And so back here are the number of sales that we had at that point. This is Christmas that year. And we had the obligatory beanbags and things like that, and we're operating. This is their product when I left. So you can see how those sort of drawings and mock-ups and prototypes turned into this app, which is the pictures here are showing you what the forecast, so some of the intellectual property of Evergen is being able to forecast what your solar panels will do later today, and then think about how it's going to run the battery, given those sort of forecasts, etc. The battery hardware is the big white box and things like that. So they're out there operating. They're in hundreds of homes around Australia. They have offices over CSIRO at Mayfield West is leasing them an office space. They've got an office in Sydney. They're working with one of Australia's biggest residential house builders to put these systems in people's homes. And the business is going. The interesting thing with this story, and maybe slightly different to some of the other talks you might have had for this session, is that I then left Evergen and came back to CSIRO. So that was early last year. I had the opportunity to stay. They said, so my 6-month period had turned into 2.5 years, or just over 2 years. And then at the end, and there became a point where I had to make a decision. Did I want to stay with Evergen or return back? And I decided to return and went back to CSIRO to both run the Energy Centre and do what I love doing, which, to be quite frank, is starting up lots of these businesses. So when I told people I was sort of leaving the opportunity of a company that's in the market, that's established, that at that point was looking for several $1 million of equity, to return to sort of big corporate bureaucratic research institute, there's a bit of, yeah, what? And I don't regret that decision at all. I mean, the reason for me was an entirely personal one, and it was because of what I like to do. So I had a great time getting Evergen off the ground and establishing the business and building the technology, and doing everything from sitting down with our marketing person on what's our marketing strategy, to the hipsters designing the user interface, to the hardcore engineers figuring out battery boxes. But once the business sort of reached a certain point of maturity, to be quite frank, it was much more about sales than it was about any sort of development and growth of the technology and the user interface and the user experience and so on. And so there's people out there who are better than I am at just driving sales numbers, and that wasn't me. And so it felt like the best time for the business was for me to move aside and go and do hopefully another Evergen and let someone else be there who's fundamentally driving sales numbers. And you can see that change in the culture. So I'm still certainly friendly with these guys. You can't help but be when you put so many hours of your life into it. And you can see that, now the building, so the building used to be all of our walls, you can see in the pictures. These were all numbers, that was a sales number, but the rest of the wall was focused on our sort of sprint cycles and how we were going at development. And now if you go there, it's much more focused on how many sales did we get today, last month, where are we targeting our geographic area, and things like that. So that's really my story. And I thought I came back, and we will hopefully do another Evergen, and I may or may not be CEO, but others in my team might be. And the business is out there, and I'll look, there'll be some people who did leave their jobs, others who we sort of founded with quit and went into Evergen, and I hope they're millionaires in a few years' time. I won't be, but I'll be a very proud grandfather of the organisation. Thank you. I think, the easiest thing for me was really if we just maybe have a chat and talk some questions.
Absolutely. We'll just open up to the floor, so if anyone has questions.
So those of us familiar with Reposit, is it a similar type of system to Reposit?
Yeah, it is. So I'm just getting a glass of water. So Reposit, in my opinion, would be one of those businesses that filled that dotted box. So Reposit's another company that appeared around the same time as Evergen, and they offer They offer management of household battery systems. They won't sell you the battery. You get someone else's battery and someone else's solar, and then Reposit come and put a little box in that turns it on and off and tells it what to do. So absolutely they're competitive.
How do you compete against the Tesla power?
Well, we don't. There's a Freudian slip already. Evergen, because I'm not there anymore. But Evergen they actually use the Tesla Powerwall. So they have that battery that I showed, and that's their own offering made by someone else. And then today they actually do use the Tesla Powerwall. So they will put their stuff on top of the Tesla Powerwall, and they worked with Tesla to be able to do that. So basically you can think about it, Evergen offer intelligent control on top of Tesla. So Tesla give you the battery, but Tesla don't operate the battery. So yeah, but that was an interesting discussion on itself when I was there. And we knew Tesla was coming out. The head of Tesla Australia was a friend of mine, and we would, to be frank, we had to decide: do we compete with them or do we? Because every other vendor really wanted to be our friend because they were sort of, well, how do we make ourselves different? We're not, we're Samsung. Can we compete with Tesla, or do we partner with someone like Evergen? Anyway. There was a lot of strategic discussion because you have this giant Goliath entering the market, is that a threat or not? It's an interesting call. Yeah.
Does that partnership mean that you have the opportunity, Evergen has the opportunity to expand overseas?
Well, I hope so. Certainly all of the business planning was that Evergen would move overseas for sure, and do and grow into Southeast Asia and things like that. But the Tesla partnership isn't sort of the key driver of that, but yeah, they certainly intend to move overseas. And Australia is really at the forefront of some of this craziness. There's not many other countries in the world, and certainly not in our region, that people in homes are putting batteries in right now, but they are in Australia, and if you can do it right in Australia, then when other countries catch up, there'll be an opportunity to go there.
So is Tesla the only partnership, or would you partner with LG and Samsung?
Yeah, so they've got two companies they work with closely right now. Evergen does, hardware providers. One's Tesla and one's a company that that helps produce the white box, which is actually a Chinese battery vendor. But they work. When I was there, a lot of the process was evaluating different vendors and sitting down with them and saying, can we partner with you? Can we put your guts inside our pretty box and things like that? Evergen wasn't a company that wanted to make a battery. They wanted to overlay control on top of someone else's battery. But we did have requirements on batteries that the market couldn't provide you at that time. We thought it had to be a monolithic box, as in one big box. It had to be properly outdoor. We wanted a system that could actually be installed outdoors. Those sort of things didn't exist. So you see a Tesla Powerwall, what they never show you is that it's actually got a bunch of other boxes next to it that it won't work unless it's got those boxes. So there were requirements we had where we had to work with vendors. We couldn't work with everyone. Reposit works with a whole bunch. They've got a thing they call Reposit Ready, but they didn't have those sort of requirements. They just needed a communications interface to the battery, whereas we said we wanted to be able to go outdoors, we wanted it to be a big monolith and all these sort of things for reasons of our goal around consumer experience. Yeah.
Did you have to talk to the power companies at all?
Not in the, yes and no. We didn't have to do anything different than any other solar equipment provider. So if you go to get solar panels in your house, you have to talk to power companies, and so we do that. But that's just the same as anyone else putting solar. And maybe there's again, being really open, there was another key strategic question where we said, well, so if you look at Evergen's competitors, almost all of them have now been bought or heavily invested in the incumbent power companies. So they were the disruptors, and then the incumbents poured money into them and sucked them up. Evergen, I can't say too much, but that was a really interesting question. Do you get bought? Do you allow yourself to be bought by an incumbent? And then, of course, that's great because it gives you a lot of money and a lot of time, a lot of runway for your business. Or do you not and try and continue to be taking a different approach? And that's one of the key things when you're sort of trying to disrupt the market, trying to think about that's really hard.
So weren't you already bought with the AMP investment in some ways from the beginning, or is that their investment actually wasn't all that big?
No, they were a key investor, but AMP are purely a dollar provider, if that makes sense. They invest in, and sometimes it's not even the majority, in a power company, but the power autonomous in its operation, if you know what I mean. So AMP were just providing dollars. They never had a conversation about, well, we think you should go in this direction in how you interface with the issue. They never said, we don't want you to disrupt our existing businesses or anything like that. But, yeah.
So those other companies in some ways being bought so that they can buy the market in a way that they've established a customer base and they're acquiring them to acquire their customer base.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of views. I don't want to say, but some people would say those other companies have been bought to essentially stop them disrupting the incumbents. The incumbents have said, well, we'll buy you and then we'll change you, steer your direction, so they're going to eat up our traditional market. That's a cynical view. Positive view would be they've been bought, again, like we had initial funding because we want to get insight into how crazy new startups work and how you might. The electricity world is, I think all of us could probably say, it's not, your experience of your electricity bill, and if you've got solar or batteries, your experience of that, it could learn a lot from modern day customer experience, user interface, Apple. Do I have to use that? But you know what I mean. So you can learn. It's pretty hopeless, the user experience of all of this. So again, some of these companies have had investment from people who are just saying, well, maybe they can teach us about how we can improve our user experience thing. So, AMP's goal is to be a minority shareholder of Evergen and have other people now pour money in.
Who is your, main target market? Because I know you said you had these, B2B sort of partnerships with dealers, but then I guess down in residential land, who are do you find the people who are adopting this the quickest or most receptive?
So that was a very big part of the business planning, was figuring out the target market and what user persona would be likely to buy this. And the reality, and I'm not making, I guess I am stereotyping, but it is actually the practical reality. The target market were mums, so middle class mums living in western suburbs where they typically have a giant house with a lot of roof space, a massive electricity bill, and it's the mum that makes the financial decisions. So that's
as a middle class mum that has a lot of roof space and did put solar panels on, and Ian down here helped me do that at the time. Not in Western Sydney though, I'm not using the aircon very much, but your business model, obviously you knew that the feed-in tariff, again, I'm probably going to get the terminology wrong, was going to end, and that was about a year ago.
Yeah.
I know I looked at everything at that point and just went, oh, this is all too hard, I'll just wait to see where the dust settles and then I'll go and think about a battery. Was that worked into your business model that we know there's going to be this date and we're going to target those people?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the frustrations when you're doing a startup, right, is we knew all of New South Wales and then Queensland, and then there were different time frames where each state was coming off tariffs and things. And you go, holy crap, there's amazing opportunity here, because there's people like yourself and others who, their bill's about to take a step change up, literally, their electricity bill. And so you go, there's an incredible opportunity. These people might be at the point where they go, wow, I just got a heap of bill shock, I want to do something. And I don't care if it costs me $6,000, I just want to do something. So we knew the opportunity. The frustration, again, when you do this sort of startup thing, is that there's no way we could target all of New South Wales, let alone those other states. So we had to target particular postcodes, and it was even smaller than that when it first launched, because that was only about 6 months after the business launched. We targeted the ACT because of things happening down there, and we targeted CSIRO and AMP employees. And that's how small it was. But, we were at the point where we could do 5 installs a week, and we were struggling, not to get them, but to do them and do them well. So this is one of the challenges you have, and you could see this amazing opportunity. And even if someone says to you, and this is not Evergen, but I'll give you $10 million, you can't ramp from 0 to 10 to spend it in 6 months. So there's really, it can be very frustrating in some sense. But yeah, it was. That's a very long-winded way of saying yes. They were targeting people that we could see were going to have that step change. So, and we had things like we were paying students to get aerial imagery of streets and direct marketing to those people and stuff like that. Who's got solar and okay, can we market and target them and all that sort of thing.
What's the payback period on an install?
I'm going to answer for back then. So some of these questions, again, you probably need to talk to the current Evergen guy. But for back then, we were looking at customers. So it's a really interesting question. Lots of media out there will say battery systems today don't have, the payback's more than 10 years, and the warranty on these systems is typically 10 years. So lots of media will say it's more than 10 years, the warranty's only 10 years, so don't buy it. And that's classic dumb media, because all they're doing is averaging across all of Australia. And so yes, the average payback might be more than 10 years, and the warranty is 10 years, so if you're average, it's not worth you getting it. But that's just really, it's overly simplistic, because there's plenty of people who are on one side of that average. We had, the payback was 9 years, 8 years, 7 years. And so one of the tricks for someone like Evergen was, how do you find those customers who've got a payback that makes financial sense? And so that's all, I can't say for today because I don't even know what they're selling them for today. But certainly when I was there, the payback was, for a lot of customers, was 8 or 9 years who we were selling it to. And there was a lot of customers who didn't have an economic payback. They just didn't want to be buying electricity off Ausgrid, or Energy Australia, sorry. They preferred to have a battery even if the payback was 12 years.
I'm included in that boat too. So on that point, I got the solar panels through the green one, which is great because that was an interest-free thing. In your business model, did you also have something that was a finance provision, like you get a loan through AMP at a reduced interest rate to be able to install?
We did, yeah, a great question. We did at the start. It was very much part of the planning. We were going to offer various financing mechanisms, to the point where we were looking to get additional capital that you could access, that we could access, just to help people finance their systems. But when we started doing all the user testing, so there was a whole heap of user testing where we got the focus groups and did all that. What we found was most people said, I don't want finance. I'll just redraw off my mortgage, or I'll pay cash for it. So the hassle of offering the financing, we would need to get financial services licenses and all this sort of palaver. I was surprised, in the US and North America, financing of solar, again, today it really isn't, it's dropped off, but back then it was a big deal. And in Australia it's never taken off, and I suspect that's because if you look at a lot of the financing that's provided, it's pretty expensive. So we didn't. We looked at it really hard. Didn't seem to need it.
Does the Evergen system have the ability to aggregate and their households and sell it in the wholesale market like the repository does that as well?
Kind of. It has the ability to aggregate houses. You could sell it in the wholesale market, and I don't want to badmouth people, but I mean, there's an interesting question as to is anyone actually selling in the wholesale market? There's some companies doing some shadow trading, but selling in the wholesale market's actually not possible unless you're having insane numbers of people. So, so you can aggregate, and we were looking to sell that capacity to an Ausgrid, for example, who have a constraint in the local network area, which is what's happening now. AGL rolled that. So that idea where you aggregate and sell, not so much in the wholesale market, but to an Ausgrid or an Energy Australia or someone, generally they call it a virtual power station, and there's been several of them rolled out now in the last 18 months across Australia. AGL's doing a huge one down in Victoria, South Australia supposedly are doing a massive one with Tesla, etc.
Your experience with the technology, how fast do you think we could get the cost down, get the payback period down to 3 years, 2 years, so it just becomes a no-brainer sort of situation?
Well, interesting question. We know from solar, just straight solar panels, when they got to 7-year paybacks, they had a big uptick in how many people bought them. They went pretty crazy. So I think 7-year paybacks for more people. I mean, there's still a very significant market who have a 7, 8, 9-year payback today, but they tend to be people who live in big houses who use the air conditioning a lot, etc. So when it becomes a 7-year payback for a greater number of people, I expect you'll see these things everywhere. I don't think it needs to be a 3-year payback. And interestingly enough, I mean, solar today, just solar today, depending how you calculate it, got a 3 to 5 year, sorry, an 18-month to 3-year payback. And word hasn't necessarily gotten out about that, and B, if it has gotten out, people put other barriers up to say, I just don't like the look of it, things like that. So I don't know that it needs to come down to 3 years. What we tended to find was 7 years was sort of the threshold. As far as pricing,
Is there anything that's going to happen, like revolutionary in the technology that you can see that's going to push pricing down?
no, I mean, nothing revolutionary's happened in solar. It's gone down. Its pricing's dropped by, I'm going to forget the numbers off my hand, but over 80% in the last several years. So I don't think it's so much about a revolutionary change. It's more just about more mass production and just getting better at the existing technology, which is what happened in solar. Tesla gets a huge amount of attention for their gigafactory, but for that one gigafactory, there's at least 2 that are the same size, if not bigger, that are operating in China today. So there's insane volumes coming online to make these things. You just don't hear about them because they haven't got the marketing chops part of Tesla.
So in terms of your personal journey, you seem to have worked down a pretty interesting way that you got to do a startup while having very low personal risk in a way that you could actually take a leave of absence and go back.
Yeah.
Did that end up also impacting on the scale of your opportunity when you're in the startup in terms of like, sort of share allocations?
Yeah, so it was 0.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to put that on the table. So yes, I took 0 risk, essentially, because I was given time away from my job, but I had 0 upside. So if I had, it's as simple as that. So I could have, as I said, there was an opportunity to leave and to stay with the organisation, and then something might have been negotiated from that point forwards. But
So you didn't try and negotiate a share bonus sort of part of the salary package from the beginning. You just were happy to give it a try because it was interesting.
pretty much, yeah. And CSIRO is different to, for example, universities. It's just actually not possible in CSIRO. So for an employee to, whilst you're still a current employee, we can't take that sort of share allotment. So, yeah. So and again, it was.
So are you technically employed by CSIRO the whole time and on secondment, or okay?
Sort of.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah. So I'm fine with that. I've never worked so hard, honestly, in my life as far as those 2 years, but it was really fun. And that offset it. It wasn't the case of just being hard work, because we were utter masters of our own destiny. There was no excuse. So that was incredibly fun. All the stuff that you can usually say, blame someone else. Well, no. What's our legal strategy on this? Bugger it, let's make it up. What's our marketing direction? Let's make it up. And so it's incredibly rewarding. And yes, so if the guys there now who, if they come out, Evergen, I've done other businesses where they launched on the ASX, and they launched for a lot of money, and I genuinely just proudly, I would say, are involved. And if Evergen does that, it'll be the same thing. Because those guys are taking a real risk, to your point.
So now that you're back at CSIRO, what are the skills or experiences that you got through the Evergen experience that might now have changed how you approach commercialisation at CSIRO?
Interesting. So I'm not sure. I know Gary personally, and I'm not sure what background you guys have. But seeing we're in a university-based incubator space or accelerator space, one of the interesting ones for me is to think about. You can spend a lot of time if you've got a research background saying, I need to come up with some freaking amazing science or intellectual property to to make an impact or to be ahead of the crowd. And so we trick ourselves into thinking that if you want to spin it out, it needs to be the most amazing science in the world. You know, it doesn't. You know, it just needs to be a little bit better, or it just needs to fill a hole that no one else has filled. And so there's an interesting balance, and I might get shot by the uni for saying this, about thinking about, you know, do you really need this incredibly deep science to make it an amazing business, or do you just need sufficient science, and it's actually more about the marketing and all of that stuff? And that was probably something that I took away. Again, I'd done a fair few startups, but and when we at CSIRO were always doing business model canvases and thinking how do people make money from it. But because it's a research institute, we have to think about, is this science world class or not? That's not the sort of question you need to ask in something like Evergen. So that was something for me.
I think you sort of, people solve problems with whatever's in their toolkit. So if you ask an academic to solve a problem, you can't be surprised when the answer is we should do some more research. That's why people who have had experience in a few different worlds are valuable, because they have a wider toolkit to draw on when you ask them a question. They don't just say, oh, we need to do some research. They say, well, maybe I can actually do a marketing program that will solve this problem, or I can do a customer relationship program that will solve this problem, or I can just understand that yes, where the product's at to now is not the end product, but it does apply to these markets, and so it does class this class as a minimum viable product. I can get something in the marketplace. I don't have to solve all the problems for everybody first.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the minimum viable. You can use all the cute startup words you want, but the minimum viable thing is that what's really minimum viable might be a bit of an anathema to someone who's got a really deep research background. So. And that pendulum will swing around as well. I think so for a while we were very much about the technology. Then we were about the IT systems, which you just took off the shelf. Then we were about marketing and customer value. How do we sell these things? And now they're more about just how we drive sales volumes. And then I'm sure in some time soon, the Evergen leadership team will be thinking about what's our next product to stay ahead of. So, yeah.
So that wasn't coming in at the point that you were there. What's our next product? It was still just.
I was totally at the point. We had very long plans of what's our product development roadmap plans, but we couldn't implement them because we were just 100%. But well, two reasons. Using the resources we had, as in people and money, we were 100% just getting the business going and taking advantage of tariffs changes and so on. And so yeah, I mean, we were 100% doing that. So whilst we had plans, we couldn't really be implementing them at that point. But it was really important to have those plans to show a potential investor that you've thought about how you're going to be ahead of everyone else in perpetuity, hopefully. That's right.
So if you were to propose solutions for improving the transfer of solutions from the academic world out into the real world, would you focus on the researchers or the university sort of tech transfer offices or industry partners, or all of them at once?
That's a really good question. So firstly, I'd probably split that. You know, are you talking about getting the research and intellectual property out, or are you talking about getting it out into entrepreneurial sort of initiatives? If it's just out, then the way you get the technology into an IBM or a GE or whatever is totally different to this sort of thing. So I think and certainly the way I approach this in my current team, we have people who focus on that sort of stuff. How do you make these sort of things happen? I don't know if it's about focusing on the researchers as much as it is about finding the founder. You know, I was very lucky and had this opportunity, which I loved, and I'd happily do again. Most researchers, in my experience, actually, they might want to get involved in that for a little while. Maybe I'm the same, but then they want to come back to a CSIRO. So finding someone who's going to take this thing and put up with all the nutter academics and researchers, and I say that as one of them, and then so put up with them, take the personal risk that when you actually look at it rationally, anyone who does this stuff and takes the risk properly is nuts. The expected values calculation is pretty ordinary. So work with the crazy researchers and be able to be the bridge between them, take the personal risk, and then be the amazing leader. They're pretty hard to find, and so I'd focus on finding the founders.
In a way, this startup was actually quite market focused from the beginning, by the sounds of things. Like you had an industry sort of group that said, you obviously got skills, tell us where to build something in this market, and then you actually then looked at the market and said, well, I think here's the hole, let's develop a product in the hole. It wasn't like you developed a piece of technology that you were now trying to commercialise into the market. You actually started the market and worked backwards.
True, with the caveat that we pretty quickly drew lines through stuff that we didn't have the tools to build. So when we saw an opportunity, if we didn't have the tools to be able to realise that opportunity, got a line through it. So we, of course, ended up being predisposed to opportunities. We did have tools we could. So we had put batteries in and solar panels in homes and businesses in 2010 and built software to control them at CSIRO. We weren't thinking about the market, we were thinking about, well, someone else will solve the customer value proposition, we'll solve, but how do you control these things to be able to do what Repos and others do? So we had experience in the technology, we hadn't thought about using it as something you sell to mum and dad and make money from. Does that make sense?
Yes, but there's always that, you've got to have some skills or product and there's some sort of market that applies to, and finding businesses working out where those two connect in a sweet spot that the numbers add up. And a lot of academics are very focused, I think, on so they have an image of what the market might want at some stage, but they're very happy to take a lot more risk in the science side of things, to try things that might not actually work, as opposed to when you've got more of a timeline, you focus on engineering risk, not on science risk, perhaps. So your list of candidate approaches is much shorter.
Yeah, I think that's true. So, and we were lucky in that. I don't know what would have happened. Like the concreting example, we didn't have a ton of skills or tools in that, but there was arguably a business opportunity there. So if we'd gone down that road, that would have it would have been interesting to think about what that would have meant as far as feeding into the business, etc. How closely linked it would have been to CSIRO. It might have just been a case of AMP saying, well, here's some money, we want a couple of people who might have a brain in their head, start a business and figure the rest out from there, as opposed to Evergen, which was a couple of people who might have a brain in their head and some technology from CSIRO.
So it's interesting, like often when a VC is looking at like at the startup, they sort of have the three ranks, like say what's the team look like?
Yeah.
And then if there's a good team, what's their IP look like? If there's good IP, what's their sort of user base and their market penetration look like? And it sounds like when they came to you, they're right up the top of the team, and I'm happy to trust that not just that you guys could do research, but you actually, they sort of backed you to start a company in a way, which is kind of rare. Plus, I wouldn't go to many research institutions in Australia and back them to start a company. So how are you able to convince them that not only were you people with good ideas, but you were the right people back to start a business?
I don't know, from what you've spoken, it doesn't have to sound like you convinced them. They just looked at the fact that you'd spun out a few things, and that was experience. You had runs on the board in a sense.
Well, I'm uncomfortable suggesting I was particularly amazing. They came to CSIRO because of a previous piece of work we'd done, which got a lot of attention in the energy world. And they said, help us sort of understand where there's a business opportunity. It wasn't a premise about CSIRO will start the business with us. So we've done a lot of work, and I'd like to think CSIRO has a great reputation in that sector. And they just wanted to help identify opportunities. Now, as we went through that journey, I guess they got to know me and my team, and then we said, well, here's where we think is the best opportunity, and they ended up saying, well, can I get involved? So it was, I guess, what am I trying to say? we had, unlike a normal venture investment, we had the difference was we had a 6-month period where we were working really closely with these guys on a, you might call it a consulting project. So they got to know us. Yeah. So it was unusual in that sense. But there was a downside to it. So on one hand, that sounds like a luxury. The downside to that was, often startups are founded by a couple of mates who've known each other for a while, and they come together with an idea. I got plonked into a business with 2 other people, and they said, "You guys are the founders. Go forth and spend lots of time together and sleep in the same office." So that was unusual. So there was this luxury of we got to know each other and they got to know me and I at A&P, but there was this unusual thing with the founders where we suddenly had to go, right, I'm Glenn and we're all in. So, and it worked fine, but it was
So they found the other 2, or
Yeah.
you found the other 2?
No, they did.
Okay. And they deliberately picked them to have complementary skills to you.
Yeah, that's right, and that's unusual, because I think we could all say that on paper, it worked out just great. If they're watching, but
So you're sort of like a manufactured boy band as opposed to...
yeah, that's not a bad analogy. Yeah, it's kind of like that.
So they were like the record label and companies.
Right, that we worked out, and I'm Zac Efron who bailed and did his own thing, But yeah, so I think but that was an unusual dynamic at the start, and it was, I think it was, to be honest, in hindsight, I'm not sure you'd do that again, because it was fortunate that it worked out, because whilst on paper we might have had complementary skills, personality-wise it could have gone horrifically. It's super intense. God, it was fun, but that was a very intense period, and there were blow-ups, and we had to get over them and stuff, and you can't kind of just rely on professionalism when you're that much in each other's pockets. So. Yeah.
Have the investors changed over the time, or is it still the same thing?
No, they've changed, yeah.
And is that because of you needed different people, or?
Oh, they've had, so the seed investors, it's pretty much standard startup stuff. The seed investors seeded it, and then they've had other investors come in who, because the seed investors said, well, we're out, or we're at enough.
Yep.
And we want to see other people buy in to show the thing, to validate the model, if you like, and see that other people think it's and also we want to see other people come in who might bring some other strategic benefit.
Were you responsible for raising that funding, or was it?
Yep, I've sold my soul and had to sit there and talk to VCs and spend a lot of time on that. Yeah, absolutely. So it was a major part of, a lot of my job was that, whilst the team were off there trying to implement plans that we'd sketched out on a whiteboard. So, yeah.
How many rounds of funding did you do while you were there?
It depends how you count them, but I guess 3. Yeah. So it was a major part of the role. On one hand, it was very interesting. Again, for me, with my background, talking to venture capitalists, but just also other, because we were, without saying too much, Evergen was looking for investment from not necessarily the venture community, and some major corporates, and talking to these people in major corporates and looking at the level of rigor they apply to a 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 million decision. Somewhat disconcerting to a guy who considers himself a quantitative person. It was amazing how little effort they put into a $50 million investment.
Do you think that was also just because there was already a lot of money behind it to begin with, so it made it a bit easier for them?
No. I'm not sorry. I'm not necessarily saying they put little effort into us and we ended up with $50 million really easily. That would be a mistake to think I said that. No, it's because it's how they do things, because they basically say, look, we would put a person, so super companies are a classic example of this. We will put an individual, one analyst, to investigate a $200 million purchase of a hospital. I'm being a bit simplistic here. So we're not going to put one analyst on a $3 million investment just because But they can't, to do the $3 million investment proper, to give it proper analysis, probably needs one person. So you end up torn. They're saying, well, we need to give it proper rigour, but we can't spare a person to do that because it's only $3 million. So then you sort of say, well, do you give it proper rigour and then we just don't invest because it's too small, which is actually an incredibly common statement. They say, we can't give away $3 million, we need to make it 50 to get out of bed. Or do you make it 3, which is where the venture capital community sort of do it a lot better. So it's a really interesting balance, and it's surprisingly disheartening to walk out of a boardroom where they say, we love you, you're incredible, we want to invest, but can you make it $30 million instead of 3?
Did
so
you
that
do
was
that?
an incredibly common thing. No, because you can't. $30 million to spend it on, to put your hand on your heart and go, we're not going to blow it, you know, because it skews all sorts of things when you're at that point in the business. And you can see that. There's plenty of companies that get huge whacks of money and go in weird directions and fail eventually. So, better place. Big one is probably dead. Yeah. I guess that's a long way of saying I don't believe you can take $30 million at the level of maturity we were and spend it in a way that's sustainable in the long run.
Do you have any metrics on what kind of penetration the Evergen's had in the market? Do you know where it's up to? Or does anyone think those figures?
I honestly don't today,
Yeah.
because they're out there. It's been almost 12 months since I left, but they were doing pretty well when I left, and they were, so some of the metrics that are public, the AC, if you live in Canberra, there's actually a government subsidy program for putting in solar battery systems, and they publish, so they had a small number of companies that we had to compete to become eligible to take the subsidies, and they publish who was installed the most systems out of that subsidy program. So Evergen was doing pretty well for a start.
Thank you for your time.
All right.